Welcome to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, survival, and the human spirit. Before we begin this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories that will leave you speechless. The Georgia sun hung mercilessly over Magnolia Grove Plantation in the summer of 1847, its rays filtering through the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. In a small cabin tucked away from the grand white mansion, Margaret Whitmore sat alone on the edge of her narrow bed, her pale hands trembling as they clutched a letter from her mother-in-law. "Margaret, dear, it has been 5 years since your marriage to my son. The family grows concerned about the future of our lineage. Perhaps it is time to consider alternative arrangements." The words burned in her mind like brands on cattle. At 26, Margaret had become the plantation's greatest failure. A barren wife in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs. Her husband, Thomas Whitmore, had grown distant, spending more time in the fields and less time in their shared bed. The whispers among the house slaves had not escaped her notice. Margaret's cabin, originally built as a guest quarters, had become her refuge from the judgmental eyes of the main house. Here, surrounded by simple wooden furniture and faded floral wallpaper, she could cry without shame, pray without pretense, and contemplate the impossible choices that lay before her. The afternoon heat made the small space stifling. Sweat beaded on Margaret's forehead as she paced the cramped room, her cotton dress clinging uncomfortably to her thin frame. She had lost weight over the past months, her appetite diminished by constant anxiety and the bitter herbs the plantation's midwife had prescribed, remedies that had proven as useless as her prayers. The cabin itself told the story of her decline. Once carefully maintained with fresh flowers and polished surfaces, it now bore the marks of neglect. Dust gathered on the windowsills, and the once bright curtains had faded to a dull yellow. Even her personal belongings seemed to mock her. The silver hairbrush that had been a wedding gift, the delicate china tea set that had belonged to her grandmother, the leather-bound Bible, where she had once recorded the dates of her monthly courses with hopeful anticipation. Margaret walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall and studied her reflection with brutal honesty. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes, and her once lustrous brown hair had grown dull and lifeless. She looked older than her years, worn down by the constant pressure and disappointment. Her mother-in-law's letter had been the final blow, a polite but unmistakable ultimatum wrapped in the language of family concern. The Whitmore family had built their fortune on cotton and careful breeding of both their crops and their bloodline. Thomas was the only surviving son, and the pressure to continue the family name had grown unbearable. Margaret had heard the whispered conversations between Thomas and his overseer, discussions about the fertility of certain slave women and the common practice of masters taking concubines to ensure heirs when wives proved barren. A soft knock interrupted her tormented thoughts. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her appearance. "Come in," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, and Celia stepped inside. At 19, Celia possessed a natural grace that seemed to defy her circumstances. Her dark skin gleamed with perspiration from the day's work, and her calloused hands spoke of years spent in the cotton fields and the main house kitchen. Despite the coarse fabric of her work dress and the worn head wrap that covered her hair, there was something regal about her bearing, a quiet dignity that had not gone unnoticed by the plantation's inhabitants. Celia had been watching Margaret's decline with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. As one of the house servants, she had witnessed the private moments of despair, the tears hastily wiped away when footsteps approached, the way Margaret's hands shook when she thought no one was looking. But Celia had also observed something else, an intelligence and determination that most people overlooked in their assessment of the plantation mistress. "Mrs. Whitmore," Celia said, her voice steady but cautious. "Master Thomas sent me to check on you. Said you hadn't taken your afternoon meal." Margaret studied the young woman before her. Celia had been born on the plantation, the daughter of Sarah, the head cook, and a field hand who had been sold away when Celia was just a child. Unlike many of the other enslaved women, Celia could read, a skill she had acquired secretly by observing the Whitmore children's lessons from the kitchen doorway. The loss of Celia's father had shaped her in ways that Margaret was only beginning to understand. At the age of 7, Celia had watched her father loaded onto a wagon with other slaves being sold to pay off a gambling debt. The trauma of that separation had taught her that survival required more than just obedience. It demanded intelligence, planning, and the ability to recognize and seize opportunities when they arose. "I'm not hungry," Margaret replied, turning away from Celia's penetrating gaze. There was something unsettling about the way this particular slave looked at her, not with the downcast eyes and submissive posture she expected, but with a directness that suggested intelligence and, perhaps, judgment. Celia remained standing by the door, making no move to leave. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, watching and waiting for the right opportunity to approach Margaret with an idea that could change both their lives. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she spoke again. "Mrs., if I may." "You look troubled." Margaret's laugh was bitter. Troubled? That's one way to put it. She turned back to face Celia, and for a moment the careful barriers between mistress and slave seemed to waver. "Tell me, Celia, what do you know about failure?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Celia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. She thought of her father's face as the wagon pulled away, of her mother's silent tears in the months that followed, of the countless small humiliations and cruelties that defined daily life for enslaved people. "I know about surviving it, Mrs." "Surviving it," Margaret repeated, sinking back onto the bed. "Yes, I suppose that's what I'm trying to do." She looked up at Celia with sudden intensity. "Do you know why I'm here, in this cabin, instead of in the main house where a proper wife should be?" Celia hesitated. The truth was, everyone on the plantation knew. The whispered conversations in the slave quarters, the knowing looks exchanged between the house servants, the way Master Thomas had begun paying attention to some of the younger slave women. It all painted a clear picture of a marriage in crisis. But there were also rumors about Margaret's visits to doctors in Savannah, about expensive treatments that had yielded no results, about the increasing desperation that had driven her to seek solitude in this remote cabin. "I know you're hurting, Mrs.," Celia said carefully. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as 5 years of suppressed anguish poured out. "I can't give him a child, Celia. I've tried everything, prayers, medicines, treatments from doctors in Savannah. Nothing works. And now—" She held up the letter with shaking hands. "Now his family wants him to find another way." The raw pain in Margaret's voice struck Celia unexpectedly. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, both women understood the particular agony of powerlessness, the feeling of being trapped by forces beyond their control. Margaret's inability to conceive had made her as much a prisoner of her circumstances as Celia was of her legal status. Celia stepped closer, her natural compassion overriding the social boundaries that should have kept her at a distance. "Another way?" "A surrogate," Margaret whispered, the word tasting like poison on her tongue. "Someone young and fertile who can give him what I cannot." She looked directly at Celia, and in that moment, both women understood the terrible implication hanging between them. The cabin fell silent except for the distant sounds of plantation life, the lowing of cattle, the voices of field hands returning from their work, the creak of the old oak tree outside the window. Celia felt her heart begin to race as she realized why she had truly been summoned to this cabin. But alongside the fear came something else, a recognition that this moment represented the opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. "Mrs.," she said slowly, "what exactly are you asking of me?" Margaret stood and walked to the small window, gazing out at the cotton fields where dozens of enslaved people labored under the brutal sun. The sight of their bent backs and sweat-stained clothes reminded her of the vast gulf that separated her world from theirs, even as she prepared to bridge that gulf in the most intimate way possible. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I'm asking you to save my marriage, Celia. I'm asking you to give my husband the child I cannot." The words hit Celia like a physical blow. She had known this moment might come, had seen it happen to other women on neighboring plantations, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. Her mind raced through the implications, the violation of her body, the child she would bear but never truly claim, the complex web of emotions and power dynamics that such an arrangement would create. But even as horror and revulsion filled her, another part of Celia's mind began to calculate. In a world where she had no power, no choices, no control over her own destiny, this moment represented something unprecedented: leverage. Margaret needed something that only Celia could provide, and that need created a space for negotiation that had never existed before. "And what would I receive in return?" Celia asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Margaret turned from the window, surprised by the question. She had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even refusal, though they both knew refusal was not truly an option for an enslaved woman. She had not expected negotiation. The boldness of Celia's response forced Margaret to confront the reality that she was dealing with an equal, not a piece of property. I hadn't thought," Margaret stammered. "Then perhaps you should," Celia said, taking a step closer. "Because what you're asking of me is not just my body, Mrs. You're asking for my soul, my future, my very self. And in my experience, nothing of value comes without a price." The two women stared at each other across the small cabin, and in that moment, the traditional power structure of the plantation seemed to shift. Margaret, for all her legal and social authority, was the one in desperate need. Celia, despite her bondage, held something Margaret desperately wanted. It was a reversal of the natural order that both women found simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Celia's response would change both their lives forever. The afternoon shadows grew longer as Celia considered her response. Outside, she could hear the plantation bell ringing, signaling the end of the workday for the field hands. Soon the slave quarters would come alive with the sounds of evening meals being prepared and children playing in the dusty yards between the cabins. But here, in this small room that smelled of lavender water and desperation, time seemed suspended. The weight of the moment pressed down on both women, like the oppressive Georgia heat. Celia had spent her entire life preparing for an opportunity like this, though she had never imagined it would come in such a form. Every book she had secretly read, every conversation she had overheard, every observation she had made about the workings of power and privilege had led to this moment. "Freedom," Celia said finally, the word hanging in the air like a prayer. "Not just for me, but for my mother as well." Margaret's face went pale. The request was both expected and shocking in its directness. In the antebellum South, the manumission of slaves was a complex legal process, fraught with restrictions and social taboos. Free blacks faced constant harassment and the ever-present threat of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. Yet Celia was asking for the one thing that Margaret had the power to grant, but had never seriously considered giving. "Celia, you know I can't—" "Can't or won't?" Celia interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "You're asking me to bear a child that will be raised as your own, to submit to your husband's desires whenever he calls, to carry the burden of your family's future in my womb. And you think I should do this for nothing more than the privilege of remaining enslaved?" The logic was unassailable, and Margaret found herself struggling to formulate a counter-argument. She had been raised to view slavery as a natural and beneficial institution, a system that provided care and guidance for an inferior race while generating prosperity for their betters. But Celia's words forced her to confront the fundamental injustice of expecting someone to sacrifice everything while receiving nothing in return. Margaret sank into the room's single wooden chair, overwhelmed by the boldness of Celia's demands. In her sheltered world, she had never truly considered the perspective of the enslaved people who surrounded her daily life. They were fixtures, like the furniture or the landscape, necessary for the plantation's function, but not quite real in their humanity. Now, faced with Celia's intelligence and determination, that comfortable illusion was crumbling. "The plantation needs workers," Margaret said weakly. "Thomas would never agree to free valuable slaves." "Then perhaps Thomas doesn't need an heir as badly as you think," Celia replied, moving to stand directly in front of Margaret. Because I assure you, Mrs., there are other women on this plantation who could serve your purpose. But none of them can read, write, or understand the delicate nature of what you're proposing. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Celia was making it clear that she was not just another enslaved woman to be used and discarded. Her education and intelligence made her uniquely qualified for the role Margaret needed her to play. But those same qualities also made her dangerous if her cooperation could not be secured. Margaret looked up sharply. You can read? I can read, write, and cipher numbers, Celia confirmed. Skills that might prove useful in managing the discretion this arrangement would require. The implications of Celia's literacy sent a chill through Margaret. An educated slave was dangerous, capable of forging papers, communicating with abolitionists, or simply understanding far more about the world beyond the plantation than was safe for the existing order. The fact that Celia had managed to acquire these skills without detection spoke to a level of cunning and determination that Margaret had never suspected. Celia had learned to read by positioning herself near the schoolroom, where the Whitmore children received their lessons. Hidden behind the kitchen door, she had memorized the shapes of letters and the sounds they made. Later, she had practiced writing with charcoal on pieces of bark, carefully destroying the evidence of her forbidden education. The risk had been enormous. Literacy among slaves was illegal in Georgia, punishable by severe whipping or worse. "How long have you been able to read?" Margaret asked. "Since I was 12, Celia answered honestly. "I learned by watching your children's lessons and practicing with scraps of paper I found in the main house. My mother doesn't know. She would have beaten me for taking such a risk." Margaret felt a strange mixture of admiration and fear. This young woman had been living a double life for years, acquiring knowledge that could be her death sentence if discovered by the wrong people. The courage and intelligence required for such deception spoke to a strength of character Margaret had never suspected. It also explained why Celia carried herself differently from the other slaves. She possessed an inner confidence that came from knowledge and the secret awareness of her own capabilities. "If I were to consider your proposal," Margaret said carefully, "how would we arrange such a thing? The legal complications alone." Celia had been preparing for this question for years. During her secret reading sessions, she had studied not just literature and history, but also legal documents and newspapers that discussed the complex laws governing slavery and manumission. She understood the bureaucratic requirements, the financial obligations, and the social obstacles that would need to be overcome. "Leave the legal complications to me," Celia said. "I've been thinking about freedom for a long time, Mrs. I know about manumission papers, about the requirements for legal emancipation. What I need from you is a commitment, a written agreement that when I fulfill my part of this bargain, you will fulfill yours." Margaret's mind reeled. The conversation had taken a turn she never could have anticipated. What had begun as a desperate plea for help had become a complex negotiation with a woman she was beginning to realize she had drastically underestimated. The power dynamic between them was shifting with each exchange, and Margaret found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the supplicant. "And if the child is not born healthy?" Margaret asked. "If something goes wrong, then you will have lost nothing more than you've already lost," Celia replied. "But I will have risked everything, which is why I need guarantees beyond just the promise of eventual freedom." What kind of guarantees? Celia had clearly thought this through with the thoroughness of a lawyer preparing a case. Better quarters for my mother and me during the pregnancy. Access to proper medical care, not just the plantation midwife, but a real doctor from town. And protection from the overseer's whip, no matter what infractions he might claim. Margaret nodded slowly. These requests seemed reasonable, even necessary for ensuring a healthy pregnancy. The plantation's overseer, a brutal man named Jake Morrison, was known for his harsh treatment of the slaves under his supervision. Protecting Celia from his violence would require careful maneuvering, but it was certainly within Margaret's power to arrange. But Celia wasn't finished. "I also want to choose when and how this happens," she continued. "I won't be summoned to your husband's bed like some breeding animal. If we do this, it will be on terms that preserve what dignity I can maintain." The boldness of this demand took Margaret's breath away. In the world she knew, enslaved women had no say in such matters. Masters took what they wanted when they wanted it, with no consideration for the feelings or preferences of their human property. But Celia was proposing something different, a transaction between equals, despite the vast legal and social inequalities that separated them. The request also revealed something important about Celia's character. Despite her desperate circumstances, she was determined to maintain some measure of self-respect and agency. This was not a woman who would submit passively to whatever was demanded of her. She would be an active participant in her own fate, negotiating the terms of her cooperation rather than simply accepting whatever was offered. Thomas would never agree to such conditions, Margaret said. Then Thomas doesn't need to know about the conditions, Celia replied. He only needs to know that you've found a solution to your problem. How that solution is implemented can remain between us. The suggestion that they would deceive Thomas added another layer of complexity to their arrangement. Margaret would need to become an active conspirator in the seduction of her own husband, orchestrating encounters between him and Celia, while maintaining the pretense that any relationship that developed was natural and spontaneous. Margaret stood and began pacing again, her mind racing through the possibilities and pitfalls of such an arrangement. The risk was enormous. If discovered, both women could face severe consequences. Margaret could be ostracized from society, divorced by her husband, and left destitute. Celia could be sold to the brutal plantations of the Deep South or worse. But the potential reward was equally significant. An heir for the Whitmore family, and freedom for Celia and her mother. "There's something else," Celia said, her voice softer now. "The child. What happens to my relationship with the child?" This was the question Margaret had been dreading. In the traditional arrangement Celia was proposing, the child would legally belong to the Whitmores, raised as their own with no acknowledgement of its true parentage. But Celia's question suggested she wanted something more, a connection to the child she would bear, but could never publicly claim. The maternal instinct in Celia's voice was unmistakable, and it forced Margaret to confront an aspect of their arrangement she had tried to avoid considering. This would not be a simple business transaction. A child would be born from this agreement, a human being with its own needs, desires, and rights. That child would have two mothers, one legal, one biological, and the relationship between all three of them would be fraught with complexity. "The child would be raised as mine and Thomas's," Margaret said carefully. "That's the only way this could work." "I understand that," Celia replied, "but I want to remain on the plantation until the child is old enough to understand its true parentage. I want to be part of its life, even if I can never claim it publicly." Margaret felt a stab of jealousy at the thought of sharing her long-awaited child with its biological mother. But she also recognized the humanity in Celia's request, the natural desire of a mother to know and love her child. The arrangement would require both women to navigate an emotional minefield, balancing their competing claims to the same child while maintaining the fiction that Margaret was its only mother. "How long?" Margaret asked. "Until the child is 10 years old," Celia said. "Old enough to understand the truth, but young enough to accept it without resentment. And then my mother and I take our freedom and leave Georgia forever." The finality of Celia's words struck Margaret with unexpected force. She had been so focused on the immediate problem of conceiving an heir that she had not fully considered the long-term implications of their arrangement. In 10 years, she would lose not only Celia but also the child's connection to its biological heritage. The child would grow up knowing the truth about its parentage, but would have to live with that knowledge in secret, never able to acknowledge its true mother publicly. Margaret walked to the window again, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the cotton fields. In the distance, she could see Thomas riding back from his inspection of the day's harvest, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Soon, he would expect her to join him for dinner, to play the role of the dutiful wife, while they both pretended not to notice the growing distance between them. The sight of her husband reminded Margaret of everything she stood to lose if she could not provide him with an heir. The Whitmore family had made it clear that their patience was exhausted. If she could not conceive soon, Thomas would be pressured to take more drastic measures, perhaps even to set her aside in favor of a more fertile wife. The thought of losing her position, her home, and her identity as Mrs. Thomas Whitmore was more terrifying than any risk involved in Celia's proposal. "I need time to think," Margaret said finally. "Of course," Celia replied. "But don't take too long, Mrs. Time is something neither of us can afford to waste." As Celia moved toward the door, Margaret called out to her, "Celia, why are you willing to do this? Surely there must be other ways to gain your freedom." Celia paused with her hand on the door handle. The question forced her to confront the brutal realities of her situation. Other paths to freedom, escape, purchase, or gradual manumission, were either impossible or would take decades to achieve. This opportunity, terrible as it was, represented her best, and perhaps only chance to secure not just her own liberation, but her mother's as well. Because, Mrs., sometimes the only way to win a game is to change the rules. And right now, you need me more than I need you. That's not a position I'm likely to find myself in again." With that, Celia stepped out into the gathering dusk, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of an impossible decision. 3 days passed before Margaret summoned Celia back to the cabin. 3 days during which Margaret barely slept, picked at her meals, and avoided her husband's increasingly concerned questions about her health. She had spent hours walking the plantation grounds, weighing the moral complexities of what she was considering against the stark reality of her situation. During those 3 days, Margaret had also conducted her own investigation into the feasibility of Celia's demands. She had discreetly consulted legal documents in Thomas's study, researching the requirements for manumission in Georgia. The process was complex but not impossible. It required a formal petition to the state legislature, proof of the slave's good character, and a substantial bond to ensure that the freed person would not become a public burden. Margaret had also observed Celia more carefully during those 3 days, watching how she interacted with the other slaves, how she carried herself, how she managed her responsibilities in the main house. What she saw confirmed her growing impression that Celia was exceptional, not just in intelligence, but in her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of plantation life while maintaining her dignity and purpose. On the 3rd evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the first drops of a summer storm began to fall, Margaret sent word through Sarah, the head cook, that Celia should come to the cabin after the evening meal was served. The approaching storm seemed appropriate for the momentous decision Margaret was about to announce. When Celia arrived, she found Margaret sitting at the small wooden table with papers spread before her and a quill pen in her hand. The sight of the writing materials confirmed what Celia had hoped. Margaret had made her decision. But the formal arrangement of the documents also suggested that Margaret had spent considerable time thinking through the details of their arrangement. "Sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We need to discuss the details." Celia took her seat, noting the formal tone in Margaret's voice. The desperate, emotional woman from 3 days ago had been replaced by someone more composed, more businesslike. It was a transformation that spoke to hidden reserves of strength and suggested that Margaret was taking their arrangement seriously as a binding agreement, rather than a desperate gamble. The change in Margaret's demeanor also reflected the internal struggle she had undergone during the past 3 days. She had wrestled with the moral implications of what she was proposing, the risks involved, and the long-term consequences for all parties involved. But she had also come to understand that this arrangement represented her only viable option for securing her future and fulfilling her role as Thomas's wife. "I've drafted an agreement," Margaret continued, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "I want you to read it and tell me if it captures your understanding of our arrangement." Celia picked up the document, her eyes scanning the carefully written lines. The language was formal, almost legal in its precision, suggesting that Margaret had consulted actual legal documents in preparing the agreement. Agreement between Margaret Whitmore and Celia, house servant of Magnolia Grove Plantation, dated this 15th day of August, 1847. In consideration of services to be rendered by Celia in the matter of providing an heir to the Whitmore family, the following terms are agreed upon. The document outlined everything they had discussed: the promise of freedom for both Celia and her mother upon the successful birth and raising of a healthy child, the improved living conditions during pregnancy, access to medical care, and protection from punishment. But there were additional clauses that surprised Celia, suggesting that Margaret had thought more deeply about their arrangement than Celia had expected. "Education provisions," Celia read aloud, looking up at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding your literacy," Margaret explained. "If you're to remain on the plantation for 10 years after the child's birth, it would be beneficial for you to serve as a governess of sorts. Your education would need to be formalized and expanded." The suggestion revealed Margaret's practical intelligence. By positioning Celia as an educated servant with legitimate reasons to interact with the child, Margaret was creating a cover story that would explain Celia's continued presence on the plantation and her relationship with the child. It would also provide Celia with valuable skills that would serve her well in freedom. Celia continued reading, finding clauses about a monthly allowance of money to be held in trust, provisions for her mother's medical care as she aged, and even specifications about the type of housing they would be provided after gaining their freedom. The thoroughness of the document impressed her. Margaret had clearly spent considerable time thinking through not just the immediate arrangement, but its long-term implications. "This is more generous than I expected," Celia admitted. "It's also more binding," Margaret replied. "Notice the penalty clauses." Celia found the section Margaret referenced, her expression growing serious as she read. The agreement specified that any attempt by Celia to reveal the true nature of their arrangement to Thomas or anyone else would result in immediate sale to a plantation in the Deep South, a fate that was essentially a death sentence. Similarly, any failure by Margaret to honor her commitments would result in Celia's right to expose the entire arrangement, which would destroy Margaret's marriage and social standing. "Mutual assured destruction," Celia murmured. "Exactly. We're both taking enormous risks. This ensures that neither of us can betray the other without facing severe consequences." The penalty clauses reflected the harsh realities of their situation. Both women were venturing into dangerous territory where discovery could mean ruin or death. The agreement created a balance of terror that would keep both parties honest, but it also highlighted the precarious nature of their alliance. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began pelting the cabin's roof with increasing intensity. The storm seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions swirling between the two women as they contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. The sound of the rain also provided cover for their conversation, ensuring that their words would not be overheard by anyone who might be passing by the cabin. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The physical arrangements. How do you want to handle that aspect?" Celia had dreaded this part of the conversation, but she had also prepared for it. The physical relationship with Thomas would be the most difficult and degrading aspect of their arrangement, but it was also the most crucial. Without Thomas's cooperation and participation, the entire plan would fail. "I've given it considerable thought, Mrs. I believe the most dignified approach would be for you to arrange for your husband to encounter me in circumstances that would seem natural but private. Perhaps while I'm working alone in the main house during your absences." Margaret nodded, understanding the delicate psychology Celia was proposing. Rather than being summoned like a breeding animal, Celia would be positioned where Thomas might notice her and make his own advances, allowing her to maintain some semblance of choice in the matter. It would also make the relationship appear more natural and spontaneous, reducing the risk of suspicion. The approach also reflected Celia's understanding of male psychology. Thomas, like most men of his class and era, would be more comfortable pursuing what appeared to be a willing partner rather than simply taking what he wanted by force. By creating the illusion of mutual attraction, Celia could make the experience more tolerable for herself while ensuring Thomas's continued participation. "And if he doesn't respond as expected?" Margaret asked. "Then we'll need to be more direct," Celia replied. "But I believe your husband is a man with normal appetites who has been denied satisfaction in his marriage bed. Given the opportunity and the right circumstances, nature will take its course." The clinical way Celia discussed the intimate details of the arrangement struck Margaret as both disturbing and oddly comforting. It suggested that Celia had found a way to emotionally distance herself from what would essentially be a form of sanctioned rape. even if both women were careful not to use that word. The ability to compartmentalize the physical and emotional aspects of the arrangement would be crucial for Celia's psychological survival. "When do we begin?" Margaret asked. "The timing needs to be carefully planned," Celia replied. "I've been tracking my monthly cycles. If we begin next week and if conception occurs quickly, the child would be born in late spring, a good time for both mother and baby." Margaret marveled at the thoroughness of Celia's planning. This young woman had clearly been thinking about every aspect of their arrangement with a level of detail that spoke to both intelligence and determination. The fact that Celia had been tracking her own fertility cycles suggested that she had been preparing for this possibility long before their first conversation. "There's something else we need to discuss," Celia said, her tone becoming more serious. "What happens if I bear a daughter instead of a son?" Margaret had considered this possibility, and it troubled her deeply. In the patriarchal society of the antebellum South, male heirs were infinitely more valuable than female children. A daughter would not carry on the Whitmore name or inherit the plantation in the traditional manner. The pressure from Thomas's family was specifically for a male heir who could continue the family line. "A healthy child of either gender would be acceptable," Margaret said finally, "though I admit a son would be preferable. And if the child shows obvious signs of its mixed heritage?" This was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their entire plan. While Celia's skin was light enough that a child might pass for white, especially in infancy, there was always the risk that African features would become more pronounced as the child grew. A child who obviously appeared to be of mixed race would raise questions that could expose their entire arrangement. "We'll address that situation if it arises," Margaret said. "There are ways to explain such things: distant relatives with darker complexions, childhood illnesses that affect coloring. The important thing is that the child be healthy and intelligent." Celia nodded, though both women knew they were venturing into territory fraught with peril. A child who couldn't pass for white would face a lifetime of questions and potential exposure of their secret. The racial dynamics of the antebellum South made this one of the most unpredictable and dangerous aspects of their plan. "I have one final condition," Celia said, pulling a small piece of paper from her dress pocket. "I want to add this clause to our agreement." Margaret took the paper and read Celia's carefully written addition. "In the event that the child born of this arrangement shows characteristics that would make its parentage obvious, Celia and her mother will be granted immediate freedom and safe passage to a free state, with sufficient funds to establish a new life." "You're asking me to help you escape if the plan fails," Margaret said. "I'm asking you to honor the spirit of our agreement even if the letter of it becomes impossible," Celia replied. "If this child cannot pass for your biological offspring, then our entire arrangement becomes a danger to all of us. In that case, the most logical solution is for my mother and me to disappear entirely." Margaret considered this addition carefully. It was reasonable, even necessary, but it also represented another layer of risk and complexity. Helping enslaved people escape to free states was a federal crime that could result in heavy fines and imprisonment. But if their plan failed in the way Celia described, helping her escape might be the only way to prevent exposure of the entire arrangement. "Agreed," Margaret said finally, taking up her pen to add Celia's clause to the document. As Margaret wrote, Celia watched the rain streaming down the cabin's small window. Somewhere in the slave quarters, her mother was probably wondering where she was, perhaps worrying that she had gotten into trouble with the master or mistress. Sarah had no idea that her daughter was negotiating the terms of her own freedom, and Sarah's as well. The weight of responsibility for her mother's future added another dimension to Celia's decision. Sarah was approaching 50, an age when enslaved people often faced being sold to less desirable situations or simply worked to death. The promise of freedom would give Sarah a chance to live her final years in dignity, but it also meant that Celia was gambling with her mother's life as well as her own. "It's done," Margaret said, setting down her pen. She signed her name with a flourish, then slid the document across to Celia. "Your signature makes this binding." Celia took the pen, her hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. As she wrote her name, not the simple X that most enslaved people would have made, but her full name in careful script, She felt as though she was signing more than just an agreement. She was signing a declaration of her own agency, her refusal to be merely a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The act of signing her own name was itself a form of rebellion. Literacy among slaves was illegal, and the ability to sign legal documents was a privilege reserved for free people. By putting her signature on the agreement, Celia was asserting her humanity and her right to participate as an equal in determining her own fate. "When do we tell your husband?" Celia asked. "We don't," Margaret replied. "Thomas will know only what he needs to know. That I've found a solution to our problem. The details of how that solution works will remain between us." Lightning illuminated the cabin as both women contemplated the path they had chosen. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was responding to the magnitude of their decision. The thunder and lightning seemed to underscore the dramatic nature of the moment. Two women from vastly different worlds joining together in a conspiracy that would challenge the very foundations of the society that had created their desperate circumstances. "Are you certain about this, Mrs.?" Celia asked one final time. Margaret looked at the young woman across from her, this remarkable person who had somehow found a way to transform her own oppression into opportunity. The question forced Margaret to confront the full reality of what they were undertaking. There would be no turning back once they set their plan in motion. Both of their lives would be forever changed by the choices they were making in this small cabin on a stormy night. "I'm certain that we're both taking the only chance we may ever have to control our own destinies. Whether that makes us brave or foolish, only time will tell." As Celia prepared to leave, Margaret called out to her one last time, "Celia, what will you tell your mother?" "The truth," Celia replied, "that I've found a way to buy our freedom. She doesn't need to know the price." With that, Celia stepped out into the storm, leaving Margaret alone with the signed agreement and the weight of what they had set in motion. The die was cast and there would be no turning back. 6 months later, the first signs of Celia's pregnancy became undeniable. The morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks could no longer be attributed to bad food or seasonal illness. As she stood in the main house kitchen, helping her mother prepare breakfast for the Whitmore family, Celia felt the familiar wave of nausea wash over her. The kitchen was bustling with activity as the household prepared for another day. Sarah moved efficiently between the stove and the preparation tables, her experienced hands managing multiple dishes simultaneously. The other house servants went about their morning routines, unaware that one of their number was carrying a secret that would reshape the future of the plantation. "Child, you need to see the doctor," Sarah said, noting her daughter's pale complexion and the way she gripped the edge of the wooden counter for support. "You've been poorly for too long." Sarah's concern was genuine and growing. As the head cook, she was responsible for the health and welfare of the kitchen staff, and Celia's obvious illness was affecting her ability to perform her duties. But beyond her professional concerns, Sarah was worried about her daughter's well-being. The symptoms Celia was displaying were familiar to any woman who had borne children. "I'm fine, Mama," Celia replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. The past months had unfolded exactly as Margaret and Celia had planned. Thomas had indeed noticed the beautiful young house servant who seemed to appear whenever Margaret was away, visiting neighbors or attending church functions in town. The encounters had been brief at first, a lingering glance, a casual conversation about household matters, small gifts of ribbons or sweets that he claimed were left over from his business trips to Savannah. Margaret had orchestrated these encounters with the skill of a military strategist. She had carefully studied her husband's routines and preferences, identifying the times and places where he would be most receptive to Celia's presence. She had also coached Celia on how to behave, how to be present without being forward, how to show interest without appearing improper, how to maintain the delicate balance between availability and respectability. Celia had played her part perfectly, showing just enough interest to encourage his attention while maintaining the proper deference expected of an enslaved woman. When Thomas finally made his intentions clear, approaching her in the library one afternoon while Margaret was visiting her sister, Celia had submitted with what appeared to be willing compliance. The physical relationship that developed was complicated by emotions none of them had anticipated. Thomas, starved for affection and validation after years of his wife's inability to conceive, found himself genuinely caring for Celia in ways that went beyond mere physical desire. He began bringing her small gifts, a book of poetry, a silk scarf, a bottle of perfume, tokens of affection that suggested his feelings were deeper than simple lust. Celia, despite her initial revulsion, discovered that Thomas was a gentler lover than she had expected, considerate of her comfort and seemingly unaware that their encounters were anything other than a natural attraction between master and slave. His kindness made the arrangement more bearable, but also more emotionally complex, as Celia found herself struggling with unexpected feelings of affection for the man she was deceiving. Margaret, meanwhile, struggled with jealousy and relief in equal measure. Watching her husband's renewed vitality and happiness was both painful and hopeful. She knew that his improved mood stemmed from his relationship with Celia, but she also knew that this relationship was the key to her own salvation. The sight of Thomas humming while he shaved, or the way he smiled more frequently at dinner, provided evidence that their plan was working. The emotional toll on Margaret was considerable. She had to watch her husband fall in love with another woman while pretending to be unaware of the relationship. She had to endure his renewed sexual interest in her, a byproduct of his affair with Celia, while knowing that any child that resulted from their union would not be biologically hers. The deception required constant vigilance and emotional control that left her exhausted. Now, as Celia's pregnancy became obvious, the next phase of their plan would begin. The timing was crucial. Margaret needed to announce her own pregnancy in a way that would seem natural and believable. The months of careful planning and emotional manipulation were about to be put to the ultimate test. "Mrs. Whitmore wants to see you in her cabin," Sarah told Celia, unaware of the significance of this summons. Celia made her way to the familiar cabin, where she found Margaret pacing nervously. The past months had been kind to Margaret. The stress lines around her eyes had softened, and she had regained some of the weight she had lost during her darkest period. The hope of finally achieving motherhood had restored some of her natural beauty, but it had also added new lines of worry as the complexity of their deception became apparent. "It's time," Margaret said without preamble. "Thomas needs to know about the pregnancy." The moment they had been planning for months had finally arrived. Margaret had been preparing for this conversation, rehearsing her words and planning her performance. The success of their entire arrangement depended on Thomas believing that Margaret was carrying his child, and any mistake in her presentation could expose their deception. "How do you want to handle it?" Celia asked, settling into the chair that had become hers during their regular meetings. Over the past months, these meetings had become a routine. Margaret and Celia would meet weekly to discuss the progress of their plan, to address any complications that arose, and to maintain the emotional connection that made their conspiracy possible. Despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances, the two women had developed a relationship that was part partnership, part friendship, and part mutual dependence. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Margaret replied. "Tonight after dinner I'll tell him that I've been feeling unwell. I'll suggest that he call for the doctor tomorrow. When the doctor confirms the pregnancy, Thomas will naturally assume the child is his." It was a simple plan, but one that required careful timing and flawless execution. Margaret's monthly cycles had been irregular for years due to stress and various treatments, making it plausible that she might not have immediately recognized the signs of pregnancy. The key was to present the symptoms in a way that would seem natural and believable to both Thomas and the doctor. "What about the physical evidence?" Celia asked. "Your body hasn't changed the way mine has." Margaret had anticipated this problem and had been working on a solution for weeks. "I've been padding my dresses slightly, gradually increasing the size over the past few weeks. By the time the doctor examines me, I'll be showing appropriately for someone in her 4th month." Celia marveled at the thoroughness of Margaret's deception. The white woman had proven to be as skilled at subterfuge as any enslaved person fighting for survival. Margaret had studied pregnancy symptoms, practiced her performance, and even consulted medical texts to ensure that her presentation would be convincing to a trained physician. The padding strategy was particularly clever. By gradually increasing the size of her apparent pregnancy over several weeks, Margaret had created a believable progression that would seem natural to anyone who observed her regularly. She had also been careful to display other symptoms of pregnancy, changes in appetite, morning sickness, and mood swings that would support her claim. "And after the birth?" Celia asked. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Margaret replied. "For now, we need to focus on maintaining the illusion through the pregnancy." The birth itself would be the most challenging aspect of their deception. They would need to coordinate the timing so that Celia's labor and Margaret's supposed labor occurred simultaneously. They would also need to ensure that the same child appeared to be born from Margaret while actually being born from Celia. The logistics were complex and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and the cooperation of trusted accomplices. That evening, Margaret's performance was flawless. She complained of fatigue and nausea during dinner, mentioning that she had missed her monthly courses for several months. Thomas, who had been distracted by his own secret relationship, suddenly focused all his attention on his wife. "Could you be?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. The hope in Thomas's voice was genuine and heartbreaking. Despite his affair with Celia, he still loved his wife and desperately wanted to have a family with her. The possibility that Margaret might finally be pregnant filled him with joy and renewed his commitment to their marriage. "I don't want to get our hopes up again," Margaret replied carefully, "but perhaps we should have Dr. Morrison examine me." The doctor's visit the next day confirmed what everyone hoped to hear. Margaret Whitmore was indeed expecting a child, due to arrive in early spring. Thomas was ecstatic, immediately beginning plans for converting one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery and sending letters to family members with the joyous news. Dr. Morrison's examination had been cursory, as was typical for the era. Margaret's padding and her skillful presentation of symptoms had been sufficient to convince him of her condition. The doctor's confirmation provided the official validation that made their deception complete and believable to the entire community. As the months progressed, the deception became increasingly complex. Margaret had to maintain the appearance of pregnancy, while Celia, now showing obviously, had to be kept away from Thomas and other plantation visitors, who might notice the coincidence of two pregnant women. Celia was moved to a cabin on the far edge of the plantation, ostensibly to recover from a bout of fever. Only Margaret, Sarah, and the plantation's midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Bess, knew the truth about Celia's condition. Even Sarah believed that her daughter had been taken advantage of by an overseer or visiting trader, a common enough occurrence that required no further explanation. The isolation was difficult for Celia, but it also provided her with something she had never experienced before: time to think, to read, and to plan for the future. Margaret had kept her promise about education, providing Celia with books on history, literature, and even basic law. During the long winter months, Celia educated herself with a voraciousness that would serve her well in the free life she hoped to achieve. The books Margaret provided were carefully chosen to prepare Celia for freedom. She studied geography to understand the routes to free states, history to understand the political forces that shaped the nation, and literature to refine her understanding of language and culture. The education was both practical and transformative, giving Celia the tools she would need to navigate the world beyond the plantation. As spring approached, both women grew increasingly anxious. The birth would be the most dangerous part of their plan, the moment when their deception could be exposed if anything went wrong. They had rehearsed the logistics repeatedly, but they both knew that childbirth was unpredictable and that their carefully laid plans could be disrupted by medical complications or unexpected circumstances. On a warm April morning, Celia's labor began. Aunt Bess attended the birth in the remote cabin, while Margaret, supposedly in labor herself, remained in the main house with Dr. Morrison in attendance. The timing had to be perfect. Both births needed to occur within hours of each other to maintain the illusion. Celia's labor was long and difficult. As she struggled through the pain, she thought about the child she was bringing into the world, a child who would never know its true mother, who would grow up with privileges that Celia herself could never enjoy. The irony was not lost on her that she was literally giving birth to her own freedom, but at the cost of losing the child she was creating. The physical pain of childbirth was compounded by the emotional agony of knowing that she would have to give up her baby immediately. Every contraction brought her closer to both liberation and loss, creating a complex mixture of hope and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with light skin and features that could easily pass for white, Aunt Bess quickly cleaned and wrapped him before spiriting him away to the main house. There, Dr. Morrison would deliver the same child from Margaret, who had been simulating labor pains with remarkable authenticity. The baby's appearance was crucial to the success of their plan. His light skin and European features would allow him to pass as Thomas and Margaret's biological child without raising suspicion. The genetic lottery had favored their deception, providing them with a child who could seamlessly integrate into white society. Celia was left exhausted and empty-armed, her body aching not just from childbirth, but from the immediate separation from her son. This was the price of freedom, a price that felt almost too high to bear in that moment of profound loss. The maternal instincts that had been awakened during pregnancy were now focused on a child she could never publicly claim. But even as tears streamed down her face, Celia reminded herself that this was not an ending but a beginning. The child would live, would thrive, would have opportunities that no enslaved person could ever dream of. And in 10 years, when he was old enough to understand, she would tell him the truth about his heritage and the sacrifice that had secured his future. In the main house, Thomas Whitmore held his newborn son with tears of joy streaming down his face. He had finally achieved his dream of an heir, never suspecting that the child's true mother was recovering in a cabin less than a mile away. The baby's cries filled the nursery that Thomas had so carefully prepared, and he began making plans for his son's education and future. Margaret, exhausted from her own performance, watched her husband's happiness with mixed emotions. She had achieved her goal, saved her marriage, and secured her position in the family. But she also knew that this child would always be a reminder of the complex web of deception and sacrifice that had brought him into the world. The sight of Thomas cradling the baby with such tenderness filled Margaret with both relief and guilt. She had given him what he most desired, but she had done so through an elaborate deception that involved the exploitation of another woman. The moral complexity of their arrangement would haunt her for years to come, even as she celebrated the success of their plan. As the plantation celebrated the birth of the Whitmore heir, Celia began the long process of recovery, not just from childbirth, but from the emotional trauma of giving up her child. She had 10 years to wait before she could claim her freedom, 10 years during which she would watch her son grow up, calling another woman mother. The immediate aftermath of the birth was carefully managed to maintain their deception. Celia was kept in isolation for several weeks, supposedly recovering from her illness, while Margaret played the role of the new mother with convincing authenticity. The baby was presented to visitors and family members as the long-awaited Whitmore heir, and no one questioned the legitimacy of his parentage. But she had also gained something invaluable, proof that even in the most oppressive circumstances, it was possible to negotiate, to plan, to seize control of one's destiny. The child sleeping peacefully in the main house nursery was not just the Whitmore heir. He was also the key to Celia's freedom and a testament to the power of two women who had refused to accept the limitations that society had placed upon them. The months following the birth brought new challenges and adjustments for all parties involved. Thomas threw himself into fatherhood with enthusiasm, spending hours in the nursery and making elaborate plans for his son's future. Margaret had to learn to be a mother to a child who was not biologically hers, while maintaining the pretense that he was her own flesh and blood. Celia, meanwhile, was gradually reintegrated into plantation life, taking on new responsibilities that would eventually position her as the child's governess and teacher. The transition was carefully orchestrated to seem natural, with Margaret citing Celia's intelligence and reliability as reasons for promoting her to a position of greater responsibility. The story of their pact would remain secret for years to come, but its consequences would ripple through generations, challenging the very foundations of the world that had created the need for such desperate measures in the first place. The child born from their arrangement would grow up in a world of privilege and opportunity, never knowing that his very existence was the product of an extraordinary act of courage and sacrifice by two women who had dared to challenge the system that sought to control their destinies. As the seasons changed and the child grew from infant to toddler, the complex relationships between the three adults who shaped his world continued to evolve. Thomas remained devoted to his son and grateful to his wife for finally giving him an heir. Margaret found unexpected joy in motherhood, even as she struggled with the knowledge of the child's true parentage, and Celia watched from the shadows, counting the days until she could claim both her freedom and her right to acknowledge the child she had brought into the world. The pact between Margaret and Celia had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but it had also created new challenges and moral complexities that none of them had fully anticipated. The child who was meant to solve their problems had instead created new ones, forcing all three adults to navigate uncharted territory in their relationships with each other and with the society that surrounded them. 10 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1858, a well-dressed woman and her elderly mother boarded a northbound train in Savannah, Georgia. The younger woman carried papers identifying her as Miss Celia Freeman, a free woman of color, along with documentation of a substantial bank account that would allow her to start a new life in Philadelphia. The transformation in Celia's appearance was remarkable. Gone was the simple dress and head wrap of an enslaved woman, replaced by the fashionable attire of a free person of means. Her posture was different too, no longer the careful deference of slavery, but the confident bearing of someone who owned her own destiny. The education Margaret had provided over the past decade was evident in every aspect of her presentation, from her refined speech to her elegant mannerisms. Sarah, now in her 60s but still alert and dignified, marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had never fully understood the arrangement that had secured their freedom, but she had watched her daughter transform from an enslaved house servant into an educated woman of remarkable accomplishment. The years had been kind to Sarah as well. The improved living conditions and medical care that Margaret had provided had allowed her to age with grace and dignity. Behind them, at Magnolia Grove Plantation, 10-year-old James Whitmore was asking his father why his favorite teacher had suddenly left without saying goodbye. The boy's questions were innocent but persistent, reflecting the genuine affection he had developed for the woman who had been such an important part of his early education. James was a bright, curious child who had inherited both his biological mother's intelligence and his adoptive mother's determination. Under Celia's careful tutelage, he'd learned not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also history, literature, and the complex moral questions that would shape his understanding of the world. Celia had been careful never to reveal the truth of their relationship, but she had instilled in him values of justice, compassion, and respect for all people regardless of their circumstances. Thomas Whitmore, now graying at the temples but still vigorous, struggled to explain the departure of the remarkable woman who had educated his son with such dedication and skill. He had grown to respect Celia's intelligence and had been genuinely sorry to see her go, though he accepted Margaret's explanation that she had been granted freedom as a reward for her years of faithful service. The irony was not lost on Thomas that he was mourning the departure of the woman who had given him his most precious gift, his son. But he remained unaware of the true nature of their connection, seeing Celia only as an exceptionally capable servant who had earned her freedom through dedication and hard work. Margaret Whitmore, watching from her bedroom window as the train disappeared into the distance, whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for the woman who had given her everything she had ever wanted, and who had finally claimed the freedom she had earned through the greatest sacrifice any mother could make. The past 10 years had been both the happiest and most complicated of Margaret's life. She had experienced the joy of motherhood, while living with the constant awareness that her son's true mother was always nearby. She had watched Celia's relationship with James develop, seeing the subtle ways in which the biological bond between them manifested despite the official fiction of their roles. Margaret had also grown as a person during those years. The experience of working closely with Celia had challenged her assumptions about race, intelligence, and human worth. She had come to see Celia not as property, or even as a servant, but as a partner and, in many ways, a friend. The relationship had been complex and sometimes difficult, but it had also been transformative for both women. As the train carried Celia and Sarah toward their new life in Philadelphia, Celia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The past 10 years had been a careful balancing act, maintaining her role as James's teacher, while preparing for the day when she could claim her freedom. She had used the time well, not just educating herself, but also building the financial resources and social connections that would allow her to succeed in the Free States. The money Margaret had set aside for her over the years had grown into a substantial sum, enough to purchase a small house in Philadelphia and establish herself as a teacher or governess. She had also maintained correspondence with abolitionists and free black communities in the North, creating a network of support that would ease her transition to freedom. But leaving James had been the most difficult part of their arrangement. Over the years, she had watched him grow from infant to child, had seen his personality develop, had been there for his first words, his first steps, his first day of formal schooling. The bond between them was real and deep, even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. On the night before her departure, Celia had found a way to say goodbye to James without revealing the truth of their relationship. She had given him a book of poetry, the same book that Thomas had once given her, with an inscription that read, "To James, with love and hope for your future. Remember that every person has worth and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Your teacher and friend, Celia." The inscription was carefully worded to convey her love without revealing their true connection. But she hoped that someday, when James was older and wiser, he might understand the deeper meaning behind her words and perhaps even seek her out to learn the truth about his heritage. The train journey to Philadelphia took 3 days, during which Celia and Sarah had time to process the magnitude of their transformation. They were no longer enslaved people, subject to the whims of masters and overseers. They were free citizens with the right to make their own choices, to go where they pleased, to speak their minds without fear of punishment. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. After a lifetime of having every decision made for them, the responsibility of self-determination was overwhelming. But Celia had been preparing for this moment for years, and she was ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. In Philadelphia, Celia established herself as a teacher in the free black community, using the education and skills she had acquired during her years of bondage to help other formerly enslaved people adapt to freedom. She never married, dedicating herself instead to education and the abolition movement. Sarah lived comfortably in their small house, tending a garden and enjoying the simple pleasures of freedom until her peaceful death 5 years later. Celia never forgot James, and she followed his progress from afar through letters from acquaintances in Georgia. She learned that he had grown into a thoughtful young man who questioned the institution of slavery and eventually became involved in efforts to reform the South's labor system after the Civil War. She liked to think that her influence during his early years had contributed to his moral development, even if he never knew the true source of his values. The pact between two desperate women had been fulfilled, but its legacy would endure long after both had passed from this world. James Whitmore would grow up to become a progressive voice in the post-war South, advocating for the rights of freed slaves and working to build a more just society. His children and grandchildren would carry forward the values that Celia had instilled in him, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond what either woman could have imagined. Margaret lived to see the end of slavery and the transformation of the South, often wondering what had become of the remarkable woman who had changed her life so profoundly. She never remarried after Thomas's death in 1863, dedicating herself instead to raising James and managing the plantation during the difficult years of Reconstruction. In her final years, Margaret often thought about the moral complexities of the arrangement that had shaped her life. She had achieved her goals, marriage, motherhood, social standing, but at a cost that she was only beginning to understand as she grew older. The relationship with Celia had opened her eyes to the humanity and dignity of enslaved people, leading her to question many of the assumptions she had held about race and society. The story of their pact remained secret until Margaret's death in 1875, when a letter was found among her papers addressed to James. In it, she revealed the truth about his parentage and the extraordinary sacrifice that Celia had made to secure his future. The letter also contained information about Celia's whereabouts in Philadelphia, should James choose to seek her out. James did indeed travel to Philadelphia, where he found Celia, now in her 40s, still teaching and still fighting for justice. Their reunion was emotional and complex, as both struggled to navigate the relationship between a son and the mother who had given him up for freedom. But it was also healing, allowing both of them to acknowledge the bond that had always existed between them. The pact between Margaret and Celia had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, creating not just freedom for two enslaved women, but also a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and moral complexity that would influence generations to come. It was a testament to the power of human determination in the face of impossible circumstances, and a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, individuals could find ways to assert their dignity and claim their destiny. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share it with others who appreciate powerful tales of human resilience. What did you think of Celia's incredible journey from slavery to freedom? How do you feel about the moral complexities of the arrangement between these two women? Let us know in the comments below, and stay tuned for more stories that will challenge everything you think you know about history, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Remember, these are the stories that shaped our world. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when faced with impossible choices.